Have you ever felt that strange, itchy sensation in the back of your mind when you try to recall a memory that doesn't quite fit? It's like mental static, a flickering image of a bright, sun-drenched living room, the smell of dust motes dancing in a stray beam of light, and the muffled sound of a television jingle that shouldn't feel as threatening as it does. We all have those half-forgotten fragments of childhood. We dismiss them as overactive imaginations or the natural decay of time, but lately, I've realized that some memories aren't decaying. They're festering. Most of you probably remember the Sunny Side Lane. It was one of those mid-90s puppet shows that felt like a fever dream even back then. Primary colors, exaggerated smiles, and a host who looked like he hadn't slept since the Eisenhower administration. It's a staple of nostalgia threads and do you remember listicles. But there is one specific episode that has been scrubbed from the archives. It isn't listed on the fan wikis, and the studio executives swear on their careers that it was never filmed. For years, I thought I'd dreamt it during a bout of childhood flu, a lingering nightmare born of fever and flickering cathode rays. But I wasn't dreaming. I know this because I finally found it. I found the physical proof that something went wrong on that set, something that the creators spent millions of dollars trying to bury in the deep strata of lost media history. You see, nostalgia is a powerful sedative. It smooths over the jagged edges of the past and makes us feel safe. But what happens when you peel back that soft, warm layer of memory and find something cold and calculating underneath? I'm talking to you specifically, the ones who stay up late scrolling through forums, looking for the lost and the forbidden because you feel that same itch I do. You think you're safe because you're just a spectator, an observer of a digital ghost story. But I'm holding this heavy, black plastic box in my hands right now. It's a VHS tape with no label, just a handwritten date that shouldn't exist. This isn't just a story about a hidden episode. It's a confession about what happens when you look too closely at the things that were meant to keep you company in the dark. I shouldn't have watched it. I should have left the static alone. But now that I've seen it, I can't be the only one who knows. You're part of this now. To understand the weight of what I found, you have to understand the show itself. The Sunny Side Lane wasn't trying to be high art. It was designed to be the ultimate digital babysitter, a kaleidoscopic whirlwind of forced joy that occupied that specific hazy time slot between the early morning news and the noontime soap operas. It was a world of saturation, grass so green it looked like it was glowing, a sky so blue it felt artificial, and a cast of puppets that were meant to be endearing but always felt a little too large for the frame. The central character was a puppet named Barnaby, a patchwork dog with floppy ears and a voice that sounded like a smile stretched to its breaking point. Every episode followed the same rigid formula. Barnaby would wake up, find a mystery box on his porch, and spend 22 minutes learning a lesson about sharing or counting or the importance of brushing one's teeth. It was wholesome. It was safe. It was the background noise to 1,000 childhoods. But even as a 6-year-old, I remember there was a specific quality to the show that made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't articulate. It wasn't the puppets themselves, though their glass eyes seemed to capture and hold the studio lights with an unnatural intensity. It was the framing. The camera stayed low, always at a child's eye level, which gave the impression that the set went on forever. There were no visible ceilings, just an endless, flat expanse of that impossible blue sky. And then there were the quiet moments. Occasionally the music, a jaunty, MIDI-composed theme, would simply stop. Barnaby would stop moving. The other puppets would go still. For 10, maybe 15 seconds, the screen would just show the set. You could hear the faint, ambient hum of the studio equipment, a low-frequency drone that felt like it was vibrating in the floorboards of my own house. Then, without explanation, the music would kick back in, and Barnaby would go back to his manic, cheerful antics. My mother used to say it was just a technical glitch or a way to save on animation costs, but I remember sitting on the carpet, clutching a plastic dinosaur, feeling like the show was waiting for me to say something back. The specific fragment that haunted me, the one that eventually drove me to find the tape, happened during a rainy Tuesday in the spring of 1996. I was home from school with a sore throat, wrapped in a knitted blanket. The episode was supposed to be about the sound of the wind. Barnaby was standing in the middle of the lane, holding a giant, colorful pinwheel. The wind machine was clearly blowing his fur back, but the background, the painted trees and the cardboard houses, remained perfectly still. It was a jarring bit of low-budget production, but that wasn't what stayed with me. Barnaby stopped spinning his pinwheel. He turned his head not toward the other puppets, but directly toward the camera. His mouth didn't move in the usual clacking rhythm of the puppeteer's hand. Instead, it hung open, revealing a dark, felt-lined void. The audio didn't cut out this time. Instead, the jaunty theme music slowed down, the pitch dropping until the cheerful trumpets sounded like groaning metal. Barnaby leaned in closer, until his plastic nose nearly touched the lens. He didn't speak in his usual high-pitched yelp. He whispered. It was a dry, papery sound, the kind of noise a dead leaf makes when it's dragged across a gravestone. He said a name. Not my name, but a name that felt like it belonged to someone sitting right next to me. Timothy, he said. The door is unlocked, Timothy. Why didn't you lock the door? What? I remember the ice-cold shock that went through me. My name isn't Timothy. I didn't know anyone named Timothy. But the sheer, localized malice in that puppet's voice was something my child brain couldn't process. I waited for the lesson. I waited for the mystery box. But the screen just flickered to black, followed by 5 minutes of dead air before the local news started. I asked my mom about the unlocked door episode for weeks, but she just looked at me with that tired, sympathetic smile parents use when they think their kid is making up stories to get attention. Eventually, I stopped asking. I pushed the memory into the basement of my subconscious, right next to the fear of the dark and the monster under the bed. But the basement was getting crowded. And as the years passed, the name Timothy started to feel less like a mistake and more like a summons. I started to realize that the show wasn't just a background noise, it was a broadcast that had been intercepted. And now, 20 years later, I've finally tracked down the source of that interception. The obsession didn't happen overnight. It was a slow creep, a gradual surfacing of that Timothy memory every time I saw a flickering light or heard a television set humming in a quiet room. I became one of those digital scavengers you see in the depths of message boards, the ones who obsess over lost media, not just for the nostalgia, but for the thrill of the hunt. There's a specific kind of FOMO that drives people like us. It's the fear that the truth is out there, rotting in a basement or sitting on a corrupted hard drive, and if we don't find it, a piece of our history or our reality is lost forever. I spent years lurking in r/list media and private Discord servers, trading rumors of banned commercials and unaired pilots. Most of it was garbage. Urban legends about SpongeBob episodes that made kids go blind, or creepy Mickey Mouse cartoons that were clearly just bad student projects. But the sunny side lane was different. Whenever I brought up the sound of the wind episode, the threads would go silent. Or worse, they'd be deleted. I started getting private messages from users with strings of numbers for names. They didn't offer answers, they offered warnings. Stop digging into the lane, one said. The puppets weren't the ones in control. Naturally, that only made the itch worse. I began tracking down the original production crew. Most of them had vanished or died under mundane but statistically unlikely circumstances, heart attacks in their 50s, single-car accidents on clear nights. I finally found a lead in a crumbling estate sale listing in a remote part of Pennsylvania. The house had belonged to a man named Arthur Vance, a former junior editor for the studio that produced the show. The listing was sparse, mostly antique furniture and boxes of assorted media. I drove 6 hours through a steady, rhythmic rain that felt like the drumming of fingers on a roof. The house was a Victorian ruin, smelling of wet wool and stagnant air. The relatives didn't care about the boxes in the garage. They just wanted the property cleared. I found it at the bottom of a plastic crate, buried under a stack of National Geographic magazines. It wasn't in a colorful sleeve like the commercial releases. It was a raw black plastic brick, the kind of heavy-duty tape used in professional editing bays. There was no title. No Barnaby's. Just a strip of masking tape on the spine with a date, May 14, 1996. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. That was the week I'd been home sick. That was the week of the rainy Tuesday. My hands were shaking so violently, I almost dropped it. The woman running the sale glanced at the tape and then at me. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, but her gaze felt like a physical weight. "That one has a lot of static," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain hitting the garage's tin roof. "Arthur used to watch it with the sound off. Said the voices didn't match the faces." I paid $5 for it, the cheapest I've ever paid for a piece of my own soul. I drove home in a trance, the tape sitting on the passenger seat like a live grenade. I kept expecting it to vanish, or for a car to pull me over and confiscate it. When I got back to my apartment, I didn't immediately put it in. I sat it on my coffee table and just stared at it. It looked so ordinary. Just a piece of magnetic tape and plastic. But I knew better. I've talked to enough archivists to know that some media isn't just recorded, it's encoded with intent. There are stories of tapes that change every time you watch them, or frequencies that resonate with the human nervous system in ways that cause hallucinations. I told myself I was being a paranoid child. I told myself I was just going to see a low-budget puppet show with some bad audio syncing and a few technical glitches. I dug my old VCR out of the closet, a heavy, silver Sony unit I'd kept for no real reason other than a refusal to let go of the past. Connecting it to my modern 4K television felt like a sacrilege, a forced marriage of the high-definition present and the grainy, shadowed past. The screen flickered to life, showing a blue no-signal box that seemed to pulsate in the darkened room. I took a deep breath, the air in my apartment feeling suddenly cold, despite the heater being on. I could feel the eyes of the community watching me through the screen, the thousands of you who are listening to this right now, waiting for the reveal. You want to know if the horror is real. You want to know if Timothy's door was ever locked. I slid the tape into the machine. The VCR made a series of mechanical groans, the sound of teeth grinding on metal as it pulled the ribbon into its gut. I sat back on the sofa, the remote gripped so hard the plastic creaked. For a long 10 seconds, there was only blackness. Then the tracking static began to dance across the screen, jagged white lines that looked like lightning bolts frozen in time. The sound was a low-frequency rumble, a throb that I felt in my teeth before I heard it in my ears. I reached for the volume, intending to turn it down, but my hands stopped. Out of the static, a familiar jingle began to play. It was the Sunnyside Lane theme, but it was wrong. It was slowed down, the cheerful MIDI bells sounding like the tolling of a funeral bell in a deep well. And then the screen stabilized. The image was crisp, too crisp for a VHS tape from 1996. The colors weren't just primary, they were aggressive. The green of the grass looked like it was bleeding into the blue of the sky. In the center of the frame stood the house. Barnaby's house. But there was no Barnaby. The porch was empty. The mystery box was there, but it had been torn open, its contents scattered across the lawn. They looked like small, white shards of calcium. I leaned forward, my face inches from the screen. The camera began a slow, agonizing zoom toward the front door. It was a cheap cardboard prop, but in the high-contrast light of the recording, it looked like heavy, rotting oak. And then, from inside the house, I heard a sound that didn't belong in a children's show. It was the sound of someone, something, trying to breathe through a throat full of water. The itch in my mind turned into a roar. I wasn't just watching a memory anymore. I was opening a door that had been shut for 20 years, and I was starting to realize that some things stay in the lost category because they are still looking for a way home. The screen flickered, a momentary seizure of tracking lines that settled into an image of the lane. It looked exactly as I remembered, yet entirely alien. The colors were so vibrant they felt like an assault, a sensory overload that made my eyes ache. The episode title card slid into view. Episode 402, Barnaby's Big Secret. There was no music this time, just a rhythmic, wet thumping sound, like a heavy heart beating inside a hollow chest. Barnaby appeared on screen, but he wasn't walking. He was already standing in his front yard, his patchwork fur matted and dull. He wasn't looking at his pinwheel or the mystery box. He was looking at me. Not at the audience, not at some generalized idea of a child viewer, but through the glass of my television and into the very center of my soul. "Hello, friend," Barnaby said. His voice was no longer the cheerful yelp of my childhood. It was deeper, resonant with a vibration that made the glass of the TV hum. "I've been waiting a long time for the tape to spin. You've grown up, haven't you? But the door is still the same." He gestured with a stiff, wooden movement toward the house behind him. The cardboard door was slightly ajar, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the studio light. Usually, the interior of the houses on the lane were bright, two-dimensional sets. This was a void. Today, Barnaby continued, his glass eyes reflecting a light source that wasn't visible on the screen. "We are going to talk about what stays behind when the lights go out. Do you remember the rules, Timothy?" My heart hammered against my ribs. There was that name again. Timothy. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to pause the tape, to eject it and throw it back into the rain, but my hand refused to move. I was a prisoner of the playback. A second puppet entered the frame, Miss Penelope, a tall, spindly bird with neon pink feathers and a beak that looked sharper than I remembered. She didn't hop or flutter. She glided on screen with a mechanical smoothness that suggested her puppeteer wasn't standing below her, but rather pulling strings from somewhere far above the blue sky ceiling. "Barnaby," she chirped, her voice a discordant mesh of bird calls and static. "The guest is here. The guest is listening. Should we show him the box?" Oh. They both turned toward the mystery box on the lawn. Barnaby reached out a felt paw, but he didn't open it. He began to stroke the lid with a slow, rhythmic motion. "Not yet, Penelope. The guest hasn't checked his own locks yet. We have to be fair. It's a lesson in safety, remember." Oh. Suddenly, the video glitched. A frame of something else flashed on screen, a split-second image of a basement, dark and damp, with a single wooden chair facing a wall. It was gone before I could process it, replaced by Barnaby, leaning so close to the camera that his plastic eyes filled the entire screen. The high-definition clarity of the VHS was impossible. I could see the individual fibers of his felt, the tiny scratches on his pupils, and something else, a thin, translucent wire protruding from his tear duct. "Are you sitting comfortably?" Barnaby whispered. The audio was so clear it felt like he was standing behind my couch, his breath tickling my ear. Because the thing about memories, Timothy, is that they aren't just in your head. They're in the air. They're in the static. And once you invite us back in, we don't have to stay on the tape anymore. Do you see the shadows in the corner of your room? Those aren't glitches. Those are the bits of us that leaked out during the tracking. Oh. I looked toward the corner of my living room. The shadows seemed deeper, more tactile, as if the darkness were curdling. The contrast framing was reaching a breaking point. On the screen, the lane was a masterpiece of artificial sunshine. In my apartment, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and old, rotting felt. The transition was no longer narrative, it was physical. The puppets began to laugh. It wasn't a scripted, educational chuckle. It was a hysterical, wheezing sound that spiraled upward in pitch until it became a piercing shriek. As they laughed, their movements became frantic, their limbs twisting into impossible angles. Miss Penelope's beak began to clack in a rapid-fire rhythm, the sound of a telegraph machine sending a desperate SOS. "Let's play a game." Barnaby shouted over the noise. "It's called Who is Under the Floor. To play, you just have to stay very, very still. If you move, the secret comes out of the box early. And nobody wants the secret to be messy, right? The camera began to pull back, but the set was changing. The painted trees were peeling away, revealing cold, gray concrete walls behind them. The impossible blue sky was flickering, showing the dark rafters of a warehouse and the silhouettes of people, tall, motionless figures, standing on catwalks high above. They weren't puppeteers. They were observers. They were dressed in lab coats, holding clipboards, their faces obscured by shadows. This wasn't a children's show. It was a recorded observation of something that shouldn't have been allowed to exist. The thumping sound grew louder, shaking the floor beneath my feet. On screen, Barnaby stood perfectly still again, his mouth hanging open in that familiar, felt-lined void. "Timothy is scared, Penelope," he said quietly. "He thinks this is a ghost story. He doesn't realize it's a census. We're just counting how many of you are left." A visual glitch tore through the center of the image, a jagged line of red and green that stayed on the screen, burning like a scar. The audio distorted into a low, guttural moan that seemed to be vibrating the very foundation of my apartment building. I reached for the remote, my thumb pressing the power button with a desperate force, but the TV stayed on. The VCR continued to hum, its mechanical parts clicking in a code I couldn't decipher. "You can't turn off the sun on the sunny side lane," Barnaby chirped, his voice returning to that horrifyingly cheerful yelp. "The tape has to finish, or the secret stays in your house forever. Now let's look inside the box. Together." The camera pounced on the mystery box. The lid began to creak open, but instead of a toy or a letter, a thick, black fluid began to ooze from the corners. It looked like ink, or perhaps old, degraded magnetic tape melted into a sludge. As the lid rose, a hand reached out from the darkness inside. It was a human hand, small, pale, and trembling. It wasn't a puppet. It was real. "Look, Timothy." Penelope screamed, her beak snapping inches from the lens. "It's a fragment. It's a piece of the past that forgot to die." The screen exploded into white noise for 3 seconds, a blinding flash that left spots in my vision. When the image returned, the lane was gone. Barnaby was standing in what looked like my own hallway. The wallpaper matched. The carpet matched. He was holding a small, silver key. "I found it, Timothy," he whispered, his glass eyes brimming with a dark, oily liquid. "I found the key to the door you didn't lock. Would you like to see what's on the other side? Or are you too busy recording your little story?" The terror had locked my muscles into a rigid, agonizing posture. But in the reflection of the TV screen, I could see them. Tall, gray figures with flickering tube faces, their long, felt-covered fingers reaching out toward my shoulders. They weren't shadows. They were the observers, and they had finally finished their census. The sound of the key turning in my real-world lock was a sharp, clinical reality that sliced through the atmospheric dread of the video. I sat paralyzed, my eyes darting between the television screen and the heavy oak door at the end of my darkened hallway. On the screen, Barnaby didn't move. He stood in the digital replica of my home, holding that silver key, his head tilted at an angle that suggested he was listening for my heart to fail. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the low-frequency hum of the VCR, which had begun to sound like a choir of voices whispering in a dead language. "Don't look away now, Timothy," Barnaby said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial rasp. "We're just getting to the part where the lesson becomes permanent." Miss Penelope glided back into the frame, her neon feathers now looking like jagged shards of glass. She wasn't chirping anymore. She was vibrating. "The broadcast worked, Barnaby," she said, her voice a layered composite of a dozen different female voices, all speaking in unison. "The frequency took hold. Look at the data points on the guest's skin. He's fully synchronized." Barnaby let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Of course he is. They all are. They think they're watching a show, but they're really just hosting the signal. You see, Timothy, the Sunny Side Lane wasn't produced in a studio. It was grown in a vacuum. The colors, the songs, the mystery boxes, they were all delivery systems for a specific kind of cognitive rot. We weren't teaching you how to share, we were teaching your brain how to open. We needed a generation of children who wouldn't notice the static behind the world. The camera pulled back, revealing the studio once more, but the observers in the catwalks were now clearly visible. They weren't human. They were tall, spindly things made of the same matted felt and plastic as the puppets, dressed in rotted lab coats, their faces featureless save for a single glowing cathode ray tube where a mouth should be. They moved with a jerky, stop-motion twitchiness that made my stomach churn. "Why do you think the show was scrubbed, Timothy?" Penelope asked, her beak clicking in time with the thumping in the walls. It wasn't because of the unlocked door. It was because the experiment was too successful. We didn't just stay in the television. We followed the signal home. We lived in the basements, the attics, and the quiet spaces behind the wallpaper. We waited for you to grow up and get lonely. We waited for you to start looking for the lost media of your youth, because curiosity is the best way to invite a ghost back into the house. On the screen, the door to the digital hallway swung open. A figure stepped out of the darkness. It was a man, or it had been once. His skin was the color of unwashed wool, and his eyes were two black buttons sewn haphazardly into his cheeks. He was wearing a tattered cardigan that looked exactly like the one I was wearing right now. "This is Arthur," Barnaby said, gesturing to the button-eyed man. "Arthur Vance. He was the editor. He thought he could hide the master tapes. He thought he could save the children from the frequency. But Arthur forgot that once you've seen the lane owns your optics. He didn't die in an accident, Timothy. He just ran out of space in the real world and had to move in with us." The button-eyed Arthur opened his mouth, but no sound came out, just a thick black smoke that smelled of burnt magnetic tape. He pointed a trembling finger at the camera. "At me." "The hidden episode isn't a secret," Penelope whispered, her spindly neck elongating until her face pressed against the glass. "It's a bridge. By playing this tape, you've reactivated the beacon. You've told the observers exactly where the last data point is. And the best part, you're sharing it. Even now you're recording this, aren't you? You're telling your audience about the colors and the puppets. You're letting the frequency glide into their ears, too. You aren't a researcher, Timothy. You're a relay station." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The world building wasn't a story, it was a manual for an invasion. The puppets weren't characters, they were interfaces for something that had been living in the static since the dawn of the television age. "Look at the mystery box again," Barnaby commanded. The camera panned down to the scattered white shards on the lawn. They weren't calcium. They were teeth. Tiny milk teeth. Thousands of them. The show required a lot of energy to maintain the blue sky, Timothy. The children of the 90s were so generous with their attention. But we need fresh focus now. We need the ones who listen to whispers in the dark. The screen began to melt. The primary colors of the lane started to run and drip like wet paint, revealing a pulsing, organic membrane underneath. The Sunny Side Lane was a skin, a thin layer of nostalgia draped over a sprawling, sentient nightmare. The thumping in the walls was now a deafening roar, and the temperature in my apartment had dropped so low that my breath was coming in thick, white plumes. "The door is open, Timothy," Barnaby chirped, his voice now a distorted scream. "It's been open since 1996. You just finally noticed the draft. Would you like to meet the puppeteers? They've been standing behind your couch for the last 10 minutes. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The terror had locked my muscles into a rigid, agonizing posture. But in the reflection of the TV screen, I could see them. Tall gray figures with flickering tube faces, their long, felt-covered fingers reaching out toward my shoulders. They weren't shadows. They were the observers, and they had finally finished their census. "Don't worry," Miss Penelope whispered, her beak brushing against the back of my neck in the real world. "The static doesn't hurt once you stop resisting the tracking. It's just like falling asleep in front of the TV. Just like being a kid again. Everything is bright. Everything is loud. And the mystery box. The mystery box is finally for you." On the screen, the button-eyed Arthur began to walk toward the camera, his movements becoming more fluid as he approached the glass. He reached out a hand, and I watched in horror as his fingers began to emerge from the surface of my television, not as light, but as physical wool-textured flesh. The breach was complete. The show wasn't on the tape anymore. It was in the room. And as the master signal reached its crescendo, I realized that the hidden horror wasn't the episode itself. It was the fact that once the broadcast starts, there is no such thing as a viewer anymore. Only a participant. And the lane is always looking for new residents. The physical sensation of Arthur's hand emerging from the screen was like a jolt of static electricity through my entire nervous system. I could see the individual fibers of his wool-textured skin, the way they snagged on the microscopic imperfections of the television glass. It wasn't light, it was mass. The room began to vibrate with a resonance that felt less like sound and more like the very atoms of my apartment were being recalibrated to match the tracking speed of the tape. I tried to push myself back, to crawl away from the sofa, but the floor felt wrong. The carpet under my palms was turning to that aggressive, glowing green felt I had seen on the screen. The normalcy of my life was being overwritten, pixel by pixel, by the artificial reality of the lane. "Timothy," the voices whispered, not from the TV, but from the vents, the walls, and the space directly behind my head. "The tracking is fixed. The image is clear now." On the screen, the image of my hallway was no longer a recording. It was a mirror. I watched myself on the television, a terrified small figure clutching a remote, while the gray, tube-faced observers stood behind me in the reflection. But when I looked over my shoulder in the real world, there was nothing but the oppressive, ozone-heavy dark. That was the true horror. I was being pulled into the broadcast. My physical body was becoming the data point. I watched on the monitor as one of the observers reached out a long, spindly finger and touched the back of my neck. In the real world, I felt a cold, needle-like sting. The audio on the tape began to distort into a rhythmic, screaming static, a sound that I realized was actually thousands of children's voices, all pitched up and layered until they became a single, piercing frequency. It was the sound of the census. Barnaby was laughing now, a jagged, mechanical sound that made the glass in my windows crack. He wasn't a puppet anymore. He was a towering mass of patchwork rot, his button eyes spinning in their sockets like reels of tape. "The secret is out, Timothy." Well, he shrieked. "The secret is that you never actually left the lane. You just forgot to look at the sky." I looked up at my ceiling. The white plaster was gone. In its place was that impossible, flat blue sky, devoid of stars or depth, illuminated by the cold, invisible glare of studio lights. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was on the set. The walls of my living room were nothing but painted cardboard flats, leaning precariously against the dark warehouse floor. The furniture, my sofa, my coffee table, my books, was being absorbed into the green felt of the lawn. The mystery box on the screen began to grow, expanding until it filled the entire frame, and then it burst. Millions of magnetic tape ribbons exploded outward, coiling around my limbs like black, plastic snakes. They were cold, smelling of vinegar and stagnant air, pulling me toward the glowing rectangle of the TV. Arthur Vance's hand gripped my throat, his felt fingers tightening with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. He wasn't trying to kill me, he was trying to pull me into the edit. "Don't fight the tracking," Arthur whispered, the black smoke from his mouth staining my face. "It's easier if you just let yourself become a fragment." I reached for the VCR, my hand moving through the thickening static like it was moving through deep water. I didn't try to power it off. The buttons were useless now, melted into the green felt. Instead, I grabbed the tape itself. I reached into the humming, mechanical gut of the machine and gripped the black plastic brick. The heat was immense, a searing digital burn that felt like it was erasing my fingerprints. With a guttural scream that was drowned out by the static, I ripped the tape out of the VCR. The sound that followed was a sickening, wet tear, the sound of reality snapping back into place. The blue sky above me shattered like glass, falling in jagged, transparent shards that vanished before they hit the ground. The green felt lawn retreated, the cardboard walls vanished, and the smell of ozone dissipated into the familiar, dusty air of my apartment. The screen went black. The VCR emitted one final, mournful groan and then fell silent, a thin wisp of acrid smoke rising from the loading slot. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air that didn't taste like burnt felt. The room was dark, save for the blinking red light of the smoke detector. My hands were empty. The tape was gone, not just from the machine, but from the room entirely. It was as if the lost media had finally found its way back to the void, taking Arthur Vance and the observers with it. But as I sat there in the silence, I noticed my television screen. Even though it was powered off, there was a faint, lingering image etched into the glass, a ghost of the lane. And in the center of that ghost, a tiny, silver key lay on the floor of the digital hallway. It wasn't a recording. It was a promise. The broadcast was over, but the door was still unlocked. The silence that followed was worse than the static. It was a hollow, expectant quiet that seemed to vibrate with the ghost of Barnaby's laughter. I spent the next few hours sitting in the corner of my room, the most well-lit corner I could find, watching the television screen as if it were a predator that had only just decided to play dead. My VCR is a hollowed-out ruin now, the internal gears twisted and melted into a shape that no longer resembles a machine. I keep thinking about what Arthur Vance said, that I was a relay station. By telling you this, by describing the colors, the puppets, and the way the shadows felt in that room, I haven't just shared a story. I've shared the frequency. You might feel a bit of that nostalgia itch now. You might feel a sudden, driving urge to go into your attic or your parents' basement to dig through those dusty plastic bins of unlabeled VHS tapes. You'll tell yourself you're just looking for old home movies or a recording of a Christmas special. But deep down, in that primal part of your brain that still fears the dark, you know what you're really looking for. You're looking for the lane. You're looking for a mystery box of your own. My advice: don't leave the tapes to rot. If you find a black plastic brick with a handwritten date from the mid-90s, throw it away. Don't check the tracking. Don't look for the hidden episodes. Because once the observers notice you're watching, they don't stop watching you back. I'm recording this on my phone now, and I can see the signal bars fluctuating in a rhythmic, pulsing pattern. It's the same tempo as the thumping I heard behind the cardboard walls. It makes me wonder if the Sunnyside Lane ever really stopped airing, or if it just moved to a different spectrum, one we carry in our pockets every day. Check your screens tonight. When the video ends and the display goes black, look closely at your reflection. If the sky behind you looks a little too blue, or if you see a flicker of pink feathers in the corner of your eye, don't turn around. Just keep staring at the black glass. Maybe if you're lucky, you'll find that the door is still locked. But me, I can hear the jingle of keys in my hallway again. And this time I don't think there's anyone left to hit stop.